Bones tardes. Jo en un moment pensava parlar en mal català, com és el meu estil, però com n'hi ha un servei de traducció simultània, m'aprofito. The domestic life of scientists is not a topic that attracts much interest, possibly because the prosaic nature of the home life of scholars does not suggest any useful research program, at least not in the history of science. In the case of Darwin, whose 200th birthday we celebrate this year, however, there's an interesting medical sidelight. He had a chronic abdominal disease, which on occasions incapacitated him, leaving him unable to function normally for weeks on end. He would vomit for whole days or weeks at a time. To this kind of chronic illness, there must be some dietary response, which Darwin's wife, Emma, was bound to answer on a trial and error basis, inasmuch as Darwin lacked a solid diagnosis, and the illness he almost certainly had, which is Crohn's disease, had not yet been described. We know a lot about Darwin because he was an avid keeper of records. He wrote something down in a notebook almost every day. He kept a log of his illness for a few years, and there are some hints of his eating habits there, particularly as he tried a variety of dietary approaches recommended by one doctor after another. But there is a resource that might be of help, which is a handwritten recipe book in which Emma wrote down around 120 recipes that may give some clues not only about what the great biologist ate, but more particularly what he ate when he was sick. So my remarks today focus on the intersection between Darwin's chronic abdominal troubles and Emma's cookbook. The fact that there was no reliable diagnosis of Darwin's illness in his own lifetime, historians have felt empowered to propose elaborate hypotheses of a psychosomatic nature, that Darwin's neurosis, however defined, was at the root of his woes. So, for example, his neurotic fear of being punished for his ideas both caused him to delay publishing The Origin of Species and to vomit incessantly when overcome with publishing anxieties. More than one historian has a stake in preserving the neurotic image of Darwin because without it, various hypotheses about his behavior don't work. For example, the notion that Darwin's neurosis caused and explains his 20-year delay in publishing, counting from the day he read Malthus's essay on population in 1838 and got the idea for natural selection. He waited until 1859 to publish his theory. So to substantiate such a claim, they overinterpret evidence in order to produce the level of neurosis required to have caused him to delay for so long. But there wasn't really any delay because Darwin never mentioned that there was a delay, and in fact he had one publishing obligation after another, which occupied him pretty much until the early 1850s. Furthermore, if Darwin was neurotic, none of the dozens of people who visited him at his house at Down ever commented on peculiar behavior. Quite the opposite, he comes across as completely normal. Darwin, just a couple of examples from memoirs written by people who visited Darwin. Darwin was simple and jovial as a boy. At dinner, sitting up on a cushion in a high chair, very erect to guard his weakness. He had the notion that if he sat very straight, it would be less wear upon his stomach. John Fiske, a great pioneer American sociologist, said, "Darwin is the dearest, sweetest, loveliest old grandpa that ever was. There is a charming kind of quiet strength about him and about everything he does. He has a mild blue eye and is the gentlest of gentle old fellows." This is, and many more like that. In fact, everyone says the same thing. He's a kind, humorous, gentle old man. No one ever mentions weird or neurotic behavior. The problem with most of this huge literature on Darwin's illness is that the authors are mainly psychiatrists and they're very careless with the symptomology, which of course they approach from the perspective of their own specialty. Crohn's disease is a chronic, relapsing illness that begins usually between 20 and 40 years of age. It does not affect life expectancy. There seems to be some genetic predisposition, and one can trace that in Darwin's family. I don't have time to do that today. He had been in Mendoza, Argentina, when he was on the voyage of the Beagle. He had been bit by a bug that is now known to be a carrier of Chagas' disease, which also had not been diagnosed during Darwin's lifetime. And so some historians have seized upon Chagas' disease as a likely alternative to the psychosomatic theory. But the symptoms are wrong. The symptoms of Chagas' disease are neurological, and Darwin's symptoms were gastrointestinal. He first got sick with symptoms of Crohn's a couple of months later when he was in Chile. He was in bed for a couple of weeks. The onset of the chronic gastrointestinal symptoms was delayed until September 1839, when he was back in London, when the disease appeared in its virulent phase. The symptoms are extreme spasmodic daily and nightly flatulence, abdominal distress with upper abdominal pain that varied greatly in intensity from slight and excruciating, and especially vomiting. And you get quotes from Darwin's log of his disease: incessant vomiting every week, suffered from almost incessant vomiting for 9 months. Hurrah, I have been 52 hours without vomiting, and so on. These episodes occurred 2 to 3 hours after eating, and there was no food in them. So they were what we call colloquially dry heaves. They were spasms, very difficult to bear since they never go away. His appetite was usually good. These symptoms increase after eating, but are lessened by eating very lightly, as prescribed by more than one doctor, or by soft foods such as plain pudding. I'll get back to his symptoms in a while, but let's look at Emma's cookbook. Its front cover bears the date May 16, 1839, when Darwin had some relatively low-level intermittent symptoms. The acute stage of his disease began in September of that year. Emma's cookbook has 122 recipes, of which 54 are desserts. That is 44% of the total. Of the 54 desserts, 34 are puddings and 7 are creams. I regard a cream as a pudding. So puddings and creams together as a percent of the whole are 34%. 44% desserts in a handwritten a domestic recipe book may seem high, but it's average for handwritten cookbooks. For example, I studied a handwritten recipe cookbook from a family in New England, 62 recipes in all from 1861 to 1922. This was a recipe book passed down from grandmother to mother to granddaughter. In this book, of the 62 recipes, 51 are desserts, which is 82%, of which 15 are puddings, or 18% of the whole. Both these sets of figures are typical of this genre of document. What may be interesting is that Emma's puddings are 34% of the whole, while Mrs. Bradley's, whose cookbook I just mentioned, are half of that, 18%. In my seminar called Cookbooks as Historical Documents, we read we read handwritten cookbooks, which the students and I buy on eBay. You can always buy handwritten cookbooks, and we looked at English cookbooks and American cookbooks, and the first thing you notice is that there's a preponderance of recipes for desserts. Why are there so many dessert recipes? Well, They have more ingredients than main dishes, and the measurements of ingredients tend to be more precise. Sweets are more temperature sensitive than meat and potatoes are. Maybe it's because also dessert recipes attain a kind of fame within a family whose members want it repeated exactly. When are we going to have Grandma's chocolate cake? And it always has to taste the same. Fourthly, anyone can remember how to roast a chicken, but to remember the ingredients of a complex cream that is served infrequently is difficult. Desserts in general are thought to be difficult to make. And indeed, before one could control the temperature of one's stove, they really were difficult to make. It's also interesting that in the collective memory of many culinary cultures, today there persists the notion that desserts are difficult to make, in spite of the fact that with today's technology, dishes that used to be difficult are no longer difficult. Soufflés, for an example. Looking at Emma's recipes, it's a milk-heavy diet of ingredients. Of her 122 recipes, 53 call for butter. That's almost half, 46%. Why so much butter? The middle decades of the 19th century represented the high watermark of the influence of French cooking on English cuisine. The key figure was Alexis Soyer, who left France after the Revolution of 1850 and became the representative French chef of his time in England. Emma's cookbook may have been compiled too early to have reflected Soyer's influence in particular, but French cuisine began earlier, and it spread most powerfully through gentlemen's clubs, to which Darwin and all his friends belonged. By 1859, the same year as The Origin of Species was published, Mrs. Beeton, the author of a famous cookbook, had to include a 3-page glossary of French terms without which she could not have written a representative cookbook. Of Emma's 122 recipes, 38% called for milk, 39% for cream, so more than half of the recipes had milk or cream in them. With respect to milk, Crohn's disease can in certain instances generate lactose intolerance, but lactose intolerance in general is associated with the lower digestive tract, and the symptom is diarrhea. Darwin's symptoms were always in the upper abdomen. He had no diarrhea. His main complaint was vomiting. Darwin was a keen observer of nature and himself. He associated his symptoms with spice and salad in particular. Salad is interesting because it has a lot of fiber in it, and in a minute you'll see when the diets that are recommended for sufferers of Crohn's disease have no fiber in them. He associated his symptoms with salad, for example, but never for dairy products. In fact, he was convinced that plain milk containing pudding lessened his sickness. Emma has a recipe for plain broth, the classic clear liquid along with tea. She says, cut meat into thin slice, put it in some boiling water, and boil it quick for 10 minutes, etc., etc. It takes a good deal of meat to make the broth good, but the same meat will do again. That is, you can use it twice. There were more clear liquids in Darwin's diet, like coffee and tea. He went back and forth on his preference, but he drank both. Florence Nightingale, the famous English nurse, incidentally, held that a great deal too much of tea is given to the sick by foolish people, she said. But Mrs. Beeton noted that, quote, the natural and almost universal craving in English sick for their tea. Beeton goes on to say, a small amount of coffee or tea is restorative, while too much, especially of coffee, impairs the little power of digestion that sick people have. Well, it occurred to me, since I was taken with the article that I read on Crohn's disease as Darwin's possible illness, it occurred to me to do something that historians never do, and that is to look at what happens today. I wanted to find out what doctors recommend for sufferers of Crohn's disease today. So I looked on the internet. Most doctors recommend a liquid diet. First, a clear liquid diet, liquids you can see through and which are easily absorbed by the intestines. Clear liquids include broth, tea, coffee, and so forth. And then as the acute symptoms ameliorate, they recommend a full liquid diet, full liquid meaning something between a solid diet and clear liquids, cream of wheat, pudding, honey, jelly, milk, white rice, plain pasta, custard. Boiled rice is also recommended for a Crohn's disease diet. One of the recipes in Emma's book is in Darwin's hand. It is the recipe for boiled rice. What was so important about boiled rice? One, that Darwin had to put it in his book, in the book himself, and second, didn't Emma know how to boil rice? But it's something that obviously he took very seriously, and there's nothing at all interesting about his recipe except that he's concerned about it. Add salt to the water, and when boiling hot, stir in the rice. Keep it boiling for 12 minutes by the watch. That may be typical of a scientist. Then pour off the water and set the pot on live coals. During 10 minutes, the rice is then fit for the table. There are 8 other recipes in Emma's book calling for rice, including that for Ilkley pudding, which, besides rice, has lemon in it. But puddings are the core of this diet. One Crohn's sufferer wrote to an internet chat group of other Crohn's sufferers. She says, pudding. Never underestimate the power of pudding. It's high in calories, but has calcium and protein. You can also eat a lot of it without getting too full. That's very interesting because Mrs. Beeton, in her famous cookbook of 1859, says about puddings that the variety of ingredients is secondary to substantiality. It's as if to say it really doesn't matter what it tastes like. What matters is that you can eat a lot of it. And that's crucial for sufferers of Crohn's disease who have trouble with so many foods. Among Emma's puddings are muffin pudding, almond pudding, citron pudding. She's got a recipe for generic small puddings, 3 eggs with an equal weight of butter, sugar, and flour, baked in an hour in a slow oven with wine sauce. She's got another recipe called pudding in haste. That is pudding when you don't have much time. Boil milk, flour, add the eggs, sugar, and nutmeg when cool. Miller's pudding, Pauline pudding, Natalia pudding, Olga pudding, Bertha pudding, the curate's pudding, Ilkley pudding, and blancmange. Ilkley was a spa where Darwin went for the water cure. The water cure simply was having gallons of cold water poured over you several times a day to shock the system. It seemed to work for a while. He must have liked the pudding there because Ilkley's pudding turns up in Emma's book. It's a variant of rice pudding, so rice again. Blancmange is historically and culturally interesting. It appears to have been a dish that developed as a result of the Arab introduction of rice and almonds in early medieval Europe. In Anglo-Norman, it's called blanc de Syrie, right, the white dish from Syria. In Catalan, it's called menjar blanc. Anybody ever hear of it? I'm sure nobody eats it anymore. It's a milk pudding with gelatin in it. It's a kind of small pudding with gelatin, that small pudding, Emma's recipe for small pudding. By Victorian times, it was no longer a dish of the aristocracy as it had been in the Middle Ages. And today it's the butt of many English jokes. There in the famous comedy series Monty Python. In one of them, a table-sized, sentient blancmange invades Earth from the planet Skyron. of the Andromeda galaxy and eats people, especially tennis players. Emma has 2 recipes for blancmange. One of them is called blancmanger Moor Park. Notice that she uses the French term, even though the common English term by then was blancmange. She says blancmanger Moor Park. Moor Park was another spa where Darwin went to take the water cure. And he brings back to his house a pudding that he had tasted there and evidently liked. This recipe has no gelatin, so it's really a custard. Another of Emma's recipes for yellow blancmange, it was called that because it contained lemon juice and lemon rind, preserved the gelatin component. The water cure seemed to help him. He wrote to Charles Lyell from Moor Park, "I can walk and eat like a hearty Christian." Recipes did not include measured ingredients until around 1800, so Emma's recipes call for a pint of cream, a pound of brandy, an ounce of gelatin, and particularly she used ingredients by weight. An ounce of powdered ginger, half an ounce of mace. Dried ingredients like flour and sugar were measured by weight. There were also old-style recipes, where all you get is some flour, enough sugar. So she's in a kind of a transient period. The transition being from very rough ideas of ingredients to one where one is concerned with measure. Excuse me. In America, let me just say a couple of more things about English cooking. If you've ever been to England and go to someone's house, you notice that they overcook vegetables, and you can't understand why they do that. In Emma's cookbook, the French-inspired recipes have short cooking times, but she recommends cooking vegetable soups for 2 hours and Italian vegetable soup for 3 hours. I looked in some current recipe books. It's basically 35 minutes that you cook a vegetable soup. One of the things I found out from this investigation is that it was widely believed that raw vegetables were harmful. And therefore you had to boil them until the harmful part had gone away. Now it just comes to mind that if you do that, if you really boil them for a long time, things like celery, you're going to weaken the fiber content, and there may be it may be that this kind of vegetable soup cooked for a long time, Emma realized by trial and error that it went better for Darwin than other kinds of soup. An American visitor to Darwin's house observed, quote, "Our dinner was noteworthy for its wholesome simplicity in these days of excessive luxury. The wholesomeness probably reflected the kind of meat and potato dishes that Americans were used to and that the Darwins enjoyed daily. The simplicity, I think, reflected the limits that Darwin's illness imposed upon wholesomeness. He could eat meals that were very plain, that had nothing fancy about them, and which were filling. And then you come back again to pudding. And it occurred to me, since there's so much indecision about what Darwin actually suffered from, that if one could establish, as I think it's possible to do, if you can establish that in a survey of present-day sufferers from Crohn's disease, that they eat a lot of pudding, we know that anecdotally, but if you could actually find out how much pudding they actually ate, then it's obvious, since Emma's cookbook is overburdened towards puddings, desserts in general, but puddings in particular, then that really is a kind of inferential proof or corroboration that what Darwin actually suffered from was Crohn's disease. And let me just close on the note of the problem with the literature with Darwin's illness is that historians have not taken the symptoms seriously, nor have they actually investigated what those symptoms might have meant for his daily life. And I think that in Emma's cookbook, you get the most direct kind of corroboration that what he actually suffered from was this dreadful upper abdominal pain. And so on that note, I conclude.